conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. So back in 1990, the UK's population was about 55 million people, and it had been settled there for a very, very long time. Boy, how things have changed. Our population now officially is 65.6 million, although I have to say, somewhat cynically, I suspect the reality is it's quite a bit higher than that. We've no idea whether it's 1 million or 2 million illegal immigrants that are living in the country. But a projection today from the Office of National Statistics says that our population will go through the 70 million mark towards the end of the 2020s. They make the point that 77% of the projected increase will come directly or indirectly from immigration. So we've already seen a huge rise in our population, and there is a lot more to come. And I'm asking you tonight, do you think we can cope with this increase? If you think, yeah, sure, there's plenty of room. I flew into the UK the other day and saw lots of green fields. Well, call me on 0345 6060 973. Perhaps you think already our public services, our transport systems are strained to the nth degree and that we can't cope and we have a real problem coming, in which case you can text to 84850. Or maybe you think these projections are wrong. Perhaps the real numbers are going to be much, much higher, in which case, using the hashtag Farage and LBC, you can tweet at LBC. So there are two big arguments here that I can see. One is that the country, the economy, simply can't cope without immigration. That actually it's been a good thing. It's brought economic benefit. The GDP of the country has gone up over the last 20 years as a result of immigration and will go up further if we continue with these numbers. The counter-argument, and the one that I believe in very strongly, is that you can't actually measure everything in this world by GDP numbers. There is something called the quality of life. And I remember very well, I was late for a meeting in Swansea a few years ago, very late for a meeting. And I sort of half-jokingly said, well, of course, the traffic in this country is getting worse because there are more people on the roads. Well, of course, I was met with the howls of outrage and indignation from the liberal media. But you know what? There was a report out a couple of weeks ago saying the British economy is losing out by about £9 billion a year from people stuck in traffic jams. My argument is we can't cope. My argument is, yeah, there may be plenty of green fields on which we can build houses if we want to build on the green belt. But what nobody has ever factored in to any of this when they say, is immigration a net plus or minus for the UK economy? What nobody ever factors in is the sheer capital cost of having to build more roads, more schools, more hospitals, and I don't think we're in any fit state to cope with another big increase in our population. Do you know, last Friday night, King's Cross Station was evacuated. No, it wasn't a bomb scare or a hoax. It was simply because of overcrowding. So I would suggest we've got a real problem. I think we're going to struggle to cope if our population goes through 70 million in a few years' time. Stuart in Putney is my first caller on this. Stuart, do you think we can cope?
Yeah, I think actually we can't cope without it, and that's just not from a liberal point of view. I just think from a practical point of view, it's what's kept our economy growing.
Right.
It's kind of inflated the country, and the only thing what's really sad is people complain of crowded streets and everywhere's being crowded, which is fair enough. But I remember the 80s and ghost towns, and you see what it's like when people leave or when things become quiet. Is actually worse. So I kind of think until we manufacture things and our economy diversifies and we start to get a more solid economy on different grounds, I think we can't cope without it. I think it's what actually has helped us.
Stuart, I've certainly seen what depopulation does. I went to Lithuania a couple of years ago, met the Prime Minister, various officials, talked about their situation, their problems. Since they joined the European Union, a quarter of their population has just left the country. So they haven't got, their young professionals, their doctors, their dentists, their accountants, they've all fled. And there are big parts of rural Lithuania where you just drive past boarded up house after boarded up house. So I get the point that depopulation can bring some huge problems. But no one's suggesting that Britain's going to be depopulated. I mean, Stuart, do you catch the London Underground on a regular basis or not?
Occasionally. Occasionally. It's always been bad.
Well, I tell you what.
Bad for various reasons, but not,
I tell you what, it's a lot more. It's a lot more crowded now than it was 20 years ago. And the argument I'm making, Stuart, to you, and you're giving me an economic argument, but would you accept my point that even if big inflows of migration have been good for GDP, and for growth figures and all the rest of it, would you accept my point that none of these studies ever take into account the capital cost of having to build more schools and more hospitals?
I accept that point, but I think on balance it's still net benefit because there's more money, the economy's been growing, it's been relatively healthy. So I think on balance at the moment, I fear that we can't afford not to have population growth, which is a kind of negative statement about our economy, but that's where we're at.
And what about the quality of life, Stuart? I mean, if we spend another 2 or 3 hours a week in the car because the roads are busier, that's not exactly well, mind you can always listen to LBC, I suppose, but in general terms, that's not good for our quality of life, is it?
No, but I don't think that's the reason why we do that. Unfortunately, I read something the other day about the terrible roadworks and just cycle lanes. I don't think the population growth, particularly, we've just built more roads. There is plenty of space. As I say, it's net benefit. I get your point,
right.
But I think it's better than being poor.
Stuart thinks it's the lesser of two evils. He thinks we can't afford to go on without it, and he's made his point very clearly. Herbie in Harrow is calling me. Herbie, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So can we cope, Herbie, with a population that continues to explode?
We can't cope, Nigel. Look, we've got a housing crisis now.
Yep.
With the amount of people we've got here. With 70 million, it will become even worse than what it already is. The hospitals can't cope. The doctors can't cope. The schools can't cope. The government's got this warning, and what do you think they're going to do? They're going to sit on their hands and do absolutely nothing until it's too late, until the whole economy collapses through pressure.
It may be worth reminding people, Herbie, but at the moment, despite the fact that 16 months ago we voted Brexit in a referendum, we still today have free movement of people from another 450 million people from the EU who are entitled to come to this country. And given that the government now wants there to be a transition period that almost certainly would take us up to the next general election, none of this looks like stopping him a short term, does it?
No, it doesn't. And the thing is, Nigel, what people seem to forget is there's over 50 million dispersed people around the world. They want to go somewhere, and it looks like a lot of them are heading for here, for God's sake. What we're going to do if we had another 20 million people coming here in this country? God knows, we can't.
Well, I don't think we are going to have that number, Herbie. But
we're going to have a few amount.
But we're going to have many, many millions more. And yeah, it is posing a real problem. And you mentioned housing. I, in the referendum, unashamedly ran a poster that said we have to build a new dwelling in this country, a new dwelling every 4 minutes, just to cope with current levels of immigration. And you can imagine it didn't make me top of the pops with the Westminster political class, but it was true. Herbie, I thank you. So Stuart says we can't live without it. Herbie says we can't cope now. Simon in Hornchurch is my next caller. Simon, good evening.
Good evening. What I was just saying to your call handler is that immigration policy in this country has always been based on political expediency, in which immigration has been justified after the fact. There's always got to be an answer as to why immigration has been allowed against the interest of the people of this country who have generally opposed it. The gentleman you just had on earlier, who mentioned about how it's pumping our economy.
Yeah.
The only reason that would be of benefit is if immigrants would be more highly productive than the native population. Otherwise, on that basis, you could increase the population to 100 million, 1 billion, and obviously economic activity would increase. But it's whether or not we're productively we're actually increasing the amount each of us is producing.
That's interesting, because actually what's happened is this period of mass immigration to Britain over the last 20 years has seen our productivity fall. We are now less productive as a nation than the French. So I think there is something in that, don't you?
It will indeed. I think there are other issues about productivity, and the other point I would make is that we don't know what the future holds. There's a lot of debate about this, but with automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, there's a lot of debate as to what jobs are going to be in the future. Certainly, certain economists say there will be new jobs created. But it's equally possible that we may have to look at a totally different sort of society in which there's much more.
No, we may well do. We may well do. We may well do, Simon. But the other point, of course, is that if you have an open border, you can't even predict for public services what the population will be. When we used to have managed migration, we knew with population growth within the indigenous community and immigration, we knew exactly what the population would be in 3, 4, 5 years' time. When Mr. Blair, who I know is a great popular figure amongst all the listeners to this show, but when Mr. Blair told us, when we opened the door to Eastern Europe, that an extra 13,000 a year would come, actually, it was hundreds of thousands a year. So it's very difficult to actually plan public services, public transport, or any of these things if you have an open door. And my worry, Simon, is that with this government dithering over Brexit the way they are, this open border is going to carry on for many, many years to come. I thank you for your call. I go to Andrew in Docklands. Andrew, good evening. So the population is going to be 70 million by the end of the next decade. Can we cope, Andrew?
Well, actually, that figure is completely wrong, Nigel, because you perhaps remember The Independent in 2007 ran a very, very big article about the population then was 77 million, and this was the supermarkets on their footfall basis. They could actually work out exactly how many people were buying what products. They say, well, this can't be, these people don't go in and buy the same thing twice and 3 times over in one day. They can tell that this was a lot of single people. This is why there was a big boom in the bag, plastic bags being used, just one small shop. We noticed all of that thing.
Well, I did say, Andrew, I did say at the top, the official figure is 65.6 million for our population, but I did express some cynicism, so maybe it's nearer 68 million, but you're suggesting it's much higher than that, are you?
Well, yes, if it was just 77 million and the supermarkets, Tesco's were actually asking for planning permission based on the need to expand their stores.
So why, Andrew? If Tesco's believe our population is 77 million, why don't they say so in public?
They did on that case, and then you didn't hear any more about it.
No,
and of course, politicians want to keep it very, very quiet as well. There's some agenda going on which nobody has voted for.
No one wants to talk about it, but Andrew in Docklands does. I thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. The Office of National Statistics tell us that in the middle of the next decade, our population will go through 70 million. Some of our more cynical callers think we could be well through that number already. And I'm asking you, can we cope with the population going up as quickly as that, and is it actually a benefit to our lives? Some say economically it is. I would argue that's pretty questionable, because nobody ever prices in the capital cost of having to build new roads, new schools, and new hospitals. And on Twitter I get, Nigel, did you just equate quality of life to less foreigners? You never stop, you lot, do you? What I'm saying is it makes sense to have a controlled immigration policy. Oh, and by the way, if a lot of foreign people are coming to the country, it also kind of helps if they speak our language and integrate in our communities. That's how we have happy, sensible towns and cities all over this country. Also on Twitter, our roads and public services are strained to capacity. Well, I tell you what they are. And I think London, travelling on the underground is absolute misery. Far worse than it was 20 years ago. By text, I get the point is, Nigel, they don't build more hospitals to cope with the increased population. Anne in Kingston says that. And Anne in Kingston is right. And it's one of the reasons we voted Brexit, is people couldn't get GP appointments. Their kids couldn't get houses. That's one of the reasons we voted Brexit. And yet, our political class are frankly ignoring that at the moment. Chance is calling me from Newark-on-Trent. Chance, a new caller to the show. Good evening.
Good evening. I think the economic argument is a total red herring, and we shouldn't be focusing on it. The duty of our government is to protect the country and its citizens for the next at least 5 generations to come. And even if we are comfortably below the population threshold, we should be ensuring that my children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren are all able to live in a society that isn't overpopulated. We don't want to be living in mega cities. We're kind of burning up all of our country's resources, space, destroying the landscape, which is what really makes Britain unique. Going away to America, I came back to the rolling hills, and even in my small hometown, there's been massive.
So you're
Chance,
you're an out-of-date romantic. you're talking about hedgerows and green countryside. Surely if we have millions more people and build lots of new towns, we'll all be richer.
No, absolutely not. We could bring it as
I just thought I'd try it on you.
No, I'd normally be laughing. It's a serious matter, though. Like,
no, it is. No, I agree with you. But when you hear the arguments made, and particularly on the BBC, of course, that immigration, without which our economy would simply fall to bits, are you telling me you don't believe what you're being told?
We have 1.49 million unemployed people already here. The education system is completely unsuitable for those going through it. I am only in the fortunate position of being self-employed and able to look after myself because I trained myself up. I trained myself up in programming because I was disillusioned. Disconnected from the whole education system. We have a real dilemma on our hands with generations of kind of Britons being brought up and not having kind of not feeling as though they can actually change the world around them. We kind of live in this static, concrete society, but it doesn't need to be that way. We just need to start kind of connecting with each other, being able to form kind of groups and actually...
Well, that's what community is about, isn't it? And I've always been a massive believer in community, and I think uncontrolled mass immigration has damaged communities, damaged our quality of life. Chance, I was teasing you. I think you're absolutely right in your analysis. That is what I believe too. The duty of government, not just to make the country safe, but to make it livable in. And I think our quality of life is diminishing the more crowded it gets. And this is particularly relevant in London and the South East. Less so perhaps in the North East or Scotland or other parts of the country. Nigel, I thought you were a clever man and you understood economics. Immigration is good for any country. Well, no. Immigration can be very good for a country, provided it's managed in terms of the numbers of people that come and the skills they've got to bring. Surely common sense dictates that simply has to be right. Peter is calling from Wimbledon. Peter, good evening. Can we cope with 70 million people in just over 10 years' time?
Nigel, I think what you're trying to do, you're trying to appeal to those disillusioned, disconnected, and to those who want to live back, go back in time and live back in the 50s and 60s. But what you're failing to grasp, and most of your followers, is basics of economics and basics of facts of life. And the basics of economics are that economical growth is generated by increasing population because people go and buying houses, people go and buying furniture, people go and buying cars, and that generates growth. And the way you're boring us to death with your love for immigrants. You know, every single subject you're coming up with, it's all immigrants' fault. Were you
first time? Do you know what, Peter? Actually, it's the first time it's been mentioned for several weeks, so you're wrong about that. And of course, you're right. If you have mass immigration, your GDP figures go up. But Peter, let me ask you. Does that mean your GDP figures per capita go up? Does it, so the overall size of the economy grows. Does it make people individually better off?
Well, it's up to individually people what they do. It's a government policies who dictates, the rates of pay and minimum wages and so on. There's so many factors you have to take into account. But Nigel, you're forgetting this, that in this country, with a better quality of health service, we're dealing with the aging population, and those aging population need someone to look after them. And the other thing is what you're forgetting to mention is most of the immigrants to this country, mainly from the EU, they're young and healthy, and they're not a drain onto the system. They're quite the opposite. They are helping the society because the older people live, they're not generating any income because they're not paying any taxes. We have to pay a pension and so on. So this is all just what you're trying to promote, your love for immigrants and blaming them on all the failures.
Peter, you are right about an ageing population being a factor, all right? In mid-2016, there were 1.6 million people aged 85 or over, and by 2040, that's going to be 3 million plus. So you're right. Part of the reason that the population's going up is because people are living longer. But it's a very, very small part of the equation. The Office for National Statistics, Peter, tell us that 77% of population increase is through immigration and those immigrants having children. And I would just ask you this. You accuse me of living in the past. There are 200 countries in the world that regulate tightly who can go and live there. Are they wrong?
Well, of course they're not, because we could regulate population immigration from non-EU countries when consecutive governments failed to do that anyway. And
no, I agree with that. I agree with that. But the overall point that a big part of Brexit was about us getting control and managing migration in a sensible, grown-up, international way. What's not to like about that?
Well, we are failing to control any immigration. What happened is there is a need in this country to have immigrants come into this country. What imagine is going to happen if you get what you wish? What's going to happen is people will go into the hospital and have plenty of free beds and no one to serve them. That's what's going to happen, Nigel.
So before 2004, before we let in 8 and then 10 former communist countries, were the coffee shops unmanned? Were the strawberries rotting in the fields? Were the hotels unstaffed? Were there not enough nurses in hospitals? It's nonsense, Peter. We dealt with all of it. Surely you can see that much of what's gone on here is the free movement of labour is something that's been encouraged by big businesses, the multinationals, the rich. I'm not against immigration at all, but we need to manage it. And I do genuinely think that with immigration or not, a rocketing population will lower our quality of life.
What government needs to do, Nigel, is invest in infrastructure. And what's going to happen? Build more cities, build more roads, and build. And that's what's happen. This investment will help the country as a whole. And consecutive governments have been failing to do this. And now immigrants are to blame in your eyes.
But the taxation, Peter, the taxation from unskilled or semi-skilled labour is never going to fund new hospitals. It's never going to fund new cities. This could come at a massive cost to this country.
Well, skilled or unskilled, this country needs immigrants in all levels, not only skilled and unskilled. Why people keep concentrating on unskilled labour? You walk around any building sites around here, it's all unskilled labouring, and done by foreigners, by people from EU countries.
Yeah. And driven the prices down and driven people out of work. Peter, it's not worked on the building sites very effectively. By the way, what do you think the right level of annual immigration is, please?
Well, I'm not a politician. I'm not the person who runs the immigration.
But you're all for it, so you must have some idea.
Well, the reason immigration happens, Nigel, is for two reasons. First of all, this country is very attractive to people who create business, and when they create business, you have working spaces and people can easily find work. And the other thing is that there is a demand for it. If foreigner comes to this country, doesn't matter EU or non-EU country, if they can't find work or find themselves useful in this country, they will fail. But the problem is that most of the foreigners who leave the comfort of their own country and come to this country, they are willing to work double and twice as hard as the people.
In some cases that is true. Of course it is. But equally, through an open door policy, we've let people in who've not been a benefit to this country in any way at all. I can see, Peter, you and I are never ever going to agree on this, but I'll try one last thing on you. Would it make sense, rather than having the open door to the EU that we've had for the last few years, would it make sense, going on from here, for our immigration to be based on a skills and points-based system and controlled in terms of numbers?
You can control everything. You can't control everything, Nigel. The problem is that the benefits you're going to get from it, they're going to be so tiny, so that all the disadvantages you're going to get from leaving the single market is going to be so detrimental.
So you think we should... So let's just be clear. You think we should continue with open-door immigration to the rest of the European Union?
It's not an open-door immigration. People who come over here in this country, like France and Germany, if they can't find work within 3 months, they lose all their benefits and everything else. So the failure of this government is just to implement them laws and the ability to do so.
Okay.
And that is what Theresa May, as a Home Secretary, failed to do so for 5 years.
Well, I'll tell you what, Peter. One thing, we'll finish this phone call on a note of strong agreement. She failed completely to control non-EU immigration, over which we do have power. You are right. I thank you for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's 7:30. Well, I can't believe there are still people out there who think that open-door immigration makes sense, but they do. And that against the background that our population is set to rocket to 70 million towards the end of the 2020s. I'm asking you whether we can cope. But a couple of other things today that have struck me really very, very much between the eyes. One is that we learned today in the House of Commons that during the transition period, which is intended to kick in after March 2019, during that period, the Common Fisheries Policy, all of their rules regulations, their quotas for what commercial fishermen can catch, their limits on sea anglers, telling them they're only allowed to take one bass home for 6 months of the year and none for the other 6 months. All of that, apparently, is going to stay in place. And surely one of the reasons we voted Brexit is to take back our territorial waters. One of the things that appalled us was the sight of hundreds of thousands of tons of good prime fish being thrown back dead into the North Sea and elsewhere. And yet the government is prepared for all of that to continue during the Brexit period. This is not what we voted for. And next week, we will do something on this show, because a few weeks ago, I went down to Ramsgate, boarded a boat run by a father and son, netters, and they showed me the fish they were catching and the fish they were having to throw back. And frankly, it's a pretty sickening sight. So we'll talk about this next week in a lot more detail. And you can't fail to have noticed that Chris Heaton-Harris, Tory MP, who wrote to British universities simply asking who was teaching Brexit and what was being taught in the universities, has been met with the most withering response. He's been called a Stalinist. He's been accused of McCarthyism, accused of censorship. Lord Patton of Oxford University, former Tory cabinet minister and European commissioner, has had a real pot back at him. Well, is it any wonder that the universities are in this position? Do you know Oxford University gets £60 million a year from the European Union? Is it any surprise they're pro-European Union? And scattered right across this country, we now have Jean Monnet professorships. Yeah, Jean Monnet, the founder of the European Union. So what happens is the European Commission give money to universities to set up chairs with professors to teach the wonders of the European Union in terms of history and economics. It literally, political propaganda being pumped out through our universities. It's something that even Stalin didn't manage to achieve, taking over our universities and not teaching our young people critical thinking. So many young people out there think there is one acceptable view, and those that don't agree with it are somehow bad, mad, and evil people. And I think this story about British universities is going to run and run. I think Chris Heaton-Harris has done us all a huge favour. A big debate is about to begin. But with our population set to hit 70 million in the next decade, if of course it's not already there, according to those who think illegal immigration is bigger than anyone dares suggest, I'm going to ask James in Southampton, who is a new caller, how do we cope, James, with a rapidly rocketing population?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on. First-time caller, as you mentioned. I 500% agree with you on the whole immigration issue. I feel that we need to vet who's coming into the country, as opposed to Mother Merkel, shall I say, letting anyone and any piece of specimen into the country. Yeah. Same as Belgium, same as France. France is ruined now. If you look at Paris, it's like you'd think it's part of the Middle East right now. And I can say that actually, because if anyone's thinking that, I'm being racist, I'm actually Moroccan Lebanese. So I'm actually, from that, shall I say, from that race that people like to, which hasn't got the best name, shall I say, in the media at the moment. But yeah, again, I 100% agree with you in the sense that my dad came over from Morocco back in 1990. He's actually a professor with a PhD. They fly him out to several different countries because of, how qualified he is. My mom is a social worker, works for works in the government, and I'm actually working in cybersecurity. So it's nothing to do with race. It's nothing to do with, you're white, so therefore you have to be, you're right wing or you're racist and so forth. It's really common sense. Argument. It's about vetting the people that are coming into your country. I'm really glad to be British in the sense that MI5 and MI6 are one of the best secret intelligence, if not the best in Europe. They put places like France and Belgium and Germany to shame because they're constantly getting hit. And it's not a religious thing. It's you could partially say it's a race thing, but it is mainly there needs to be a lot more security. There needs to be a lot more vetting, as Trump would do. I wouldn't say I'm a Trump supporter, but I can see where he's coming from in terms of why he wants to vet.
So James, having control of these things is just plain good common sense, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I 100% agree with you on this. It really is. It's not about, I mean, I'm not against immigration, obviously, because that would be hypocritical of me. But it's really, really important to pick like the needles out the haystack. The people that are best in terms of education, people that are best in terms of
James. I'm not against immigration either. I'm not against immigration. I'm for controlled, sensible immigration. And your call pleases me. As I was boarding a flight late last night in Washington, a chap came up to me, Habib. He said, I'm a British Muslim, practicing Muslim. He said, I'm British. I'm proud to be British. He said, and I agree with you. We've got to be very careful about who we let into our country because of the security concerns. And he was particularly talking about returning jihadis. James, whether it's to do with terrorism, whether it's to do with sensibly controlling the population, we have to be in control of this. And I thank you very much for your call and the way in which you put your point across. Chris is calling me from Edinburgh. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Pleasure to speak to you, first and foremost, although I do slightly disagree with you on this particular point.
Well, Chris, the whole thing about proper democratic debate, whether it's in a university, whether it's in a local pub, or whether it's me talking to Chris in Edinburgh, another first-time caller to the show, the point about democratic debate is we can do it sensibly in a grown-up way and ultimately respect the fact that other people are entitled to have different views. So, Chris, you've got your chance now on LBC to tell me where I'm going wrong.
Well, I don't necessarily think you're going wrong per se in your approach. Obviously, there needs to be some form of vetting process in place, some sort of point scheme, i.e. like they have in Australia. But there's nothing to say that we cannot cope with the growing numbers. Well, look at the space we have. Unfortunately, we designate areas within our communities as greenfield sites to prevent new houses being built there where the houses need to be built. So we're pushing people out further afield from the cities. There's nothing wrong with our infrastructure in terms of our roadways. I mean, you've travelled the world, Nigel. You know it's dishonest to say that we have a terrible road system network. That's just not true.
I think, no, actually, Chris, I'm going to disagree a little bit here. I think now travelling around the one of the things I'm really enjoying about not being UKIP leader is I'm not spending 10 hours a day in the car going all around the country giving speeches, because I promise you, Chris, the traffic out there is hell.
And perhaps here to the United States, I mean, that's a vast area, which is quite densely populated in some particular areas, but other than that, it's pretty empty.
Well, Chris, I drive through France a lot. I regularly drive from home to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. I've been doing it for 20 years. I have to say, I find driving in most parts of France, Paris excepted, where they're absolutely crackers the way they drive in Paris. But generally, Chris, driving in France is a pleasure. Driving in this country has become a serious chore.
But I mean, what aspect of our rising immigration do you think we cannot handle? That's what
I tell you what, Chris. I asked the question of callers, can we cope? And you've answered it by saying we can cope. And do you know what? Actually, I'm going to agree with you. We can cope. But does it make it a better country? Does it make it a nicer place to live? Does it improve our quality of life? And I'm going to argue, Chris, that it won't. And you live in Edinburgh, but I promise you, people living in London, working, travelling on the underground, or those people who were evacuated last Friday from King's Cross Station because of overcrowding, I think, Chris, a population rising as quickly as it is, without an infrastructure growing to match it, reduces our quality of life. That's really what I'm saying.
If I may, if you look at Japan for the time being, Japan back in 2006 had a population of, I think it was like 6% over the age of 65. Now that's 26%. And they reckon that by 2060, over 50% of Japan's population will be over 65. And that's because they've turned their nose up to immigration. And now they're facing serious problems in the next 40 years. And they're trying to encourage people, skilled labour, unskilled labour, to come in and help with their ageing population. If we were to stop immigration, even for the sake of 10 years, we'd have consequences down the line for it.
Well, Chris, I've acknowledged already, haven't I, in this show, you know, that we have 1.6 million people over the age of 85 and that will be 3 million people by 2040. I acknowledge there is a problem with an ageing population, but mass uncontrolled immigration isn't the answer, because in turn, immigrants get older too. But I do acknowledge there's a problem. Chris, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Neil says to me on Twitter, can I remind you that the Tories stated they would cut immigration to the tens of thousands in the last 3 elections. I know, Neil. It's why I'm probably more disenchanted with the career political class now than I've been at any point in my life. You are listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. Our legal population continues to rocket. I guess the illegal one probably does as well, and we're going through 70 million people before the end of the next decade. I'm asking, can we cope? But I'm really asking, does it make it a better place to live? And I genuinely don't think it does. I think there is not a cat's chance in hell of housing, of schools, of hospitals, of roads, of any form of public transport ever catching up with a population increase of that size. That is my view. On text I enjoy your LBC slot, Nigel, but stop with the immigration stuff. It is part of everyone's life across the globe. Give it a rest. Information, goods and services don't have boundaries. It's only natural that humans will follow, says Kiz. But Kiz, there are 200 countries in the world where they do actually control sensibly who comes in here. It's just us, it seems, that has got this completely and hopelessly wrong. Chris in Essex says, the same people who praise open-door immigration are exactly the same ones who object to more motorways being built and a third runway at Heathrow. They don't realise that with an expanding population comes an expanding infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I remember in 2015 debating with Sturgeon, with Miliband, and it was one of those big election debates. And I said, does anybody on the panel think there might be a link between the housing shortage in this country and open-door immigration? Oh, no, they all said. The government's just not building enough houses. Well, how can the government build enough houses if with an open-door immigration policy it hasn't got a clue how many people are coming in to the country? But I have to say, I didn't manage to get through to them. There you are. Michael is calling me from Yattendon in Berkshire. Michael, good evening.
Hello, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. So come on, you've picked up the phone, first-time caller. What motivated you?
Well, population has always been a bit of an issue for a small island like us. And honestly, when you look at the globe, it's a lot of a bigger issue. As a species, we are grossly overpopulated. We're at, what, 7, getting close to 7 billion now?
7.3 billion, I think, is the official figure, yeah.
Yeah. And I can't remember where it was I came across this, but they estimate that as a species, we should only be about between 3 and 5 billion. So we are way higher than what we should be. And a lot of it's down, I mean, I don't want to put too much blame on the poorer countries, but a lot of it's down to this misguided notion of having as many children as possible, and it doesn't actually help them. It just causes more problems. There's more of a drain on the limited resources they have, and it just doesn't fix anything. Now, if we were to take that...
Well, there was a thing, Michael, a few years ago, the Optimum Population Trust, and indeed the Green Party very much endorsed this, and I would agree with you, Michael. I think actually overpopulation is the biggest problem mankind faces on the planet today. And any concerns we have about global warming, about CO2 emissions, or whatever it may be, population actually is at the root of all of it. But, Michael, we're not having a debate tonight about the global population, important though that is. But I am asking, can we as a country cope with our population going up the way that it is? And is it desirable for our way of life?
No. We may be able to manage just about now, but as a small island, there's no way we're going to be able to cope in the future. Like, we only have a limited amount of space to work with, limited amount of beautiful Greenland to work with. And, sure, we could build more roads, more housing, more infrastructure, and we can accommodate for more people, but the same problem's just going to come back around. It's going to get filled up, and then we're going to just run into the same problem, and we're going to keep running out of more and more space, and we're just going to turn into this a dystopian giant megacity of just concrete and metal, and it's going to be...
Well, that's a horrible thought. There is quite a lot of green land out there. Some of it we wouldn't want to build on. Yattendon, of course, where you are, is a beautiful village, isn't it?
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I've been in my whole life, and I love getting around the place.
Yeah, I played cricket there about 15 years ago, and I have to confess, I was caught behind off the first delivery. And after that, I joined the Primary Club, a charity for cricketers who've been out first ball in any form of cricket. And they give money every year and help blind people play sports of all kind of different kinds. So I have fond memories of Yattendon, Michael, even if I did get a duck. And I thank you for calling in. Hugh is calling me from Duns in the Scottish borders. Hugh, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Great to speak to you.
Now, you live in one of the most sparsely populated parts of the entire United Kingdom. So perhaps this doesn't seem to be a big problem to you.
I mean, you're right in terms, we don't have as much in terms of the kind of immigration issues that affect other parts of the country. And we could, desperately do with economic development. In fact, coming up to Berg-upon-Tweed, we don't even have a dual carriageway. So it's, when you talked about how hard it is to get around, although the local areas are okay, if you're going further, it's horrendous trying to get to Newcastle and beyond. So we don't have those problems. But I think on the whole issue of immigration, we have to control it. I mean, look at the countries that have done, like Australia and before Trudeau, Canada. They helped, they avoided the recessions because they were sensible and they had very good economic policies. And I think that goes hand in hand with a sensible immigration policy.
I mean, look, Canada and Australia, not a penny piece of taxpayers' money was used to bail out the banks in those countries. That wasn't just because of immigration policy. It was because of good government, and perhaps, Hugh, good immigration policy is a symptom of good government.
Yeah, and I also think, we've had 3 million people at least come in the last 20 years, and every day you kind of, avoid hearing about the problems you have in the NHS, the problems you have with housing. I mean, it's like the pig flying across the room. It's
so obvious, isn't it? It's so obvious, and yet nobody sitting on those front benches in Westminster dares talk about it. They think the immigration question has gone away. Actually, it hasn't. It is still the number one burning issue in this country. Not immigration per se, but the effects of it on lives of ordinary people. Hugh from Scottish Borders talking, I thought, a great degree of common sense. Hamid is calling me from Bristol. Hamid, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel, and thank you for taking my call.
Not a bit.
Sorry for my accent. I am French myself, and I live here in England.
Yep.
And I indeed disagree with you and the fact that you're saying that basically foreigner coming in England and this increase in population for the future of 7 billion, you say, to 7 billion?
70 million by the end of the next decade is what we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. And the thing is, I will take just a simple example in history to illustrate what I'm saying. I don't think that it will be a worse place to be, but I think it would be a better place and it will be a chance. And I heard someone just before with a Morocco background who said that we should accept only PhDs and high profile. Here, I understand why he's saying that. But I think we should give the chance, first of all, to everybody, even like people who are escaping the country because they are persecuted. And in France, in the 15th century, the Huguenots has been persecuted by the French king.
I know. My forebears were Huguenots. I understand this, Hamid. But let me just ask you this. Do you see any limit then, or not, on the number of people that could come into the UK every year?
Tell me, sorry.
Do you see any limit on the numbers coming into this country?
Well, back in the day, 200,000 people was a lot. It was a massive immigration. And what happened, for example, for UK, UK welcomed a lot of Huguenots at the time, specifically in London. Yep. And the next 10 years after the Edidonant has been revocated, basically, and Huguenots have immigrated to England.
But it's a lot, Hamid, it's a long time ago. It's a long time ago. I mean, would, let's say, net migration of 500,000 a year, in your view, be acceptable?
The first trading place for wool. They were exporting more wool than...
Hamid, I know all of this, but let's talk about today. Would a net migratory figure of 500,000 a year, i.e. double what it is now, would that be acceptable to you?
That would be the same today. If you speak about NHS, for example, you have a lot of foreigners, you have a lot of Spanish nurses, you have a lot of...
Hamid, this is all short-term stuff. Hamid, look, I understand your argument. You think this is an unqualified good and we can do a lot for the world. Fine, I accept that. I believe there are limits. I don't even need to give you a final thought because Michael has texted me. He summed it up. He said, this is not a matter of blame, it's a matter of maths. Net immigration only adds to pressure on schools, housing, roads, the National Health Service, all of which are struggling, and they are all struggling, and our quality of life is diminishing. Of that, I've got no doubts at all. Well, thank you. I'll be back on Sunday morning. I'll be here at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. But up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.